This is the Never Ending 80s podcast. I am J.C.Hollywood, and my guest today is a music producer that you may not have heard of, but you won't soon forget. His influence can be felt literally across decades, so please sit back and enjoy my conversation with Hilton Rosenthal. Welcome to the podcast, Hilton Rosenthal. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jason. Nice to see you.
Oh, it's lovely to see you. Lovely to meet you. You are a fascinating individual. I think, as happens with a lot of people who work behind the scenes, your impact on the industry is much greater than people would know. Your name is possibly not as synonymous as some other people, particularly in the world of world music. People don't instantly, your name doesn't spring to mind, and I think it should, having done a bit of reading based on the impact that you really had. So talk us a little bit through your experiences that got you into the world music industry.
Well, it's probably by design that not too many people know. I'm not one of those to put myself out there. Right. But, I was a muso as a kid. My parents couldn't afford a piano, so they bought me a piano accordion. As a 6-year-old or 7-year-old, I started studying that and, got pretty proficient at that. But as a teenager, a little guy with round glasses and an accordion was not the hippest scene that you would see on the block. Right. So I decided in my mid-teens that I'd better learn guitar and start playing some real music that other people might enjoy of my contemporaries anyway. Right. I learned to play. I was a guitarist, not a great guitarist, but, was in a band at school, had a duo when I was at uni, doing quite a lot of work, making more than my friends that were doing full-time work. But I realized that I had a passion for music and the music industry, and was trying to work out how to get into the business. Yeah. Someone suggested, why don't you go and work for a record company? So I called up the CEO of what was then CBS Records. CBS is now Sony. Right. And said, look, I want a job. And he said, well, what do you want? I said, I don't know. So he said, well, come in and have a chat. I fortunately got through the door. And he said to me, well, what do you want to do, my boy? Do you want A&R? Do you want marketing? I said, what's A&R? I mean, literally, I knew nothing. But managed to talk myself into another interview. He said, look, the business is very small, and we really don't know what to do with you, but we think that it's time that we started building some management and succession, etc. You have a background in, I did a Bachelor of Commerce degree at university. Why don't you come work in the accounts department? So I said, look, if that's the only way I can get in, I'll go and do that. So after a year of that, and it was the most incredible background in terms of being in the music industry, because my main job was dealing with royalties for the artists and processing payments for the musicians that were doing session for you. Right. So after about a year, I went to my boss and said, look, I can't take this anymore. I've got to get out of here. If you can't find something for me, I'm out of here. He said, look, I don't know if you've got any ideas. I said, well, I've been watching what you're doing with your black musicians. This was in South Africa, of course. Yeah. Where I was born. And I said, you're really just throwing stuff at the wall here. Nobody's got any plan. You bring musicians in. I was processing fees of what was in those days $5 per side, that was per song. Right. So these guys would rehearse as much as they could and walk into the studio and just record. I processed 35 songs in one day once. Good Lord. But, so that made the equivalent of 7 singles, in the old language. Yeah. And we would take these things and then pair them up and put out singles. And I said, look, you really have to, this should be a business. The music is incredible. I had not really heard any of that music as a kid. There were very separate radio stations in South Africa for each language group. So, you know, I would maybe on the radio in the background, if someone was a cleaner was listening to the radio, I would hear a Zulu record or something, but really never understood it. I grew up loving the Beatles and the Stones.
Yeah.
But, you know, I got to really understand and love the music going into these sessions. And I wrote a business plan, and we put a business together that created a black music company. Right. Handling all our black music with tour buses and putting the guys on the road and marketing and starting. We put out one of the first albums of, you know, compilations of those groups.
Oh, right.
So that became a pretty serious business for us at that time. And a couple of months later, the head of A&R and marketing actually left the company, and I was made at the age of 21 head of A&R and marketing. So, you know, moved into general manager a couple of years later, and then decided I needed to go on my own. So I formed my own independent label at that point. I formed my own company and signed a bunch of artists, and decided that it should just be a mix of all types of music. So I had rock artists, I had ethnic artists, built up a really nice catalog of music that no one else really was concentrating on. So, for example, I'd find a Sotho choir that had hundreds of thousands of fans, but nobody ever played on radio, didn't do any of these guys, were performing out at churches and whatever. I had a Sotho band, which was in fact the precursor. It was a similar group to Tawe Matseka, which were the guys that played on Boy in the Bubble. Yeah. Et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I kind of got to understand the African music and the rock music, and always had this dream of finding a way to combine the two. Right. And eventually discovered these two guys, a white guy and a black guy, Johnny Clegg and Sipho Mkhunu, who were playing. Yep. And we put together a band called Juluka. And a lot of people in Australia certainly don't know much about Juluka, but Juluka was firstly the first commercial mixed race group in South Africa. Yeah. Refused to ever play to segregated audiences, which was illegal. There were shows that were shut down, guys were arrested, et cetera, et cetera. But even though radio and radio stations certainly wouldn't embrace them there, because this was a mixture of English and Zulu choruses and things like that. So we'd go into the radio station and say, listen to this amazing song, and they'd go, but you can't mix English and Zulu, so we can't play it. And then, of course, it wasn't hip enough for the FM stations, the top 40 stations, who were really at that stage playing all European disco stuff. Right. So we hammered along, and eventually got success in 1983. We put out our first single in England, got to the top 40, a song called Scatterings of Africa. It was a hit in a number of other countries. And then Sipho decided that he'd had enough of touring the world and wanted to be back in his tribal area in Zululand. So he left, and Johnny formed a new band called Johnny Clegg and Savuka, which became a huge, huge hit in Europe. And the story carries on from there. Yeah. Yeah, it's I read a quote, especially about Juluka, where they said it was the music was too black for a white audience and too white for a black audience. Which exactly. Yeah. I heard that play. Yes, I can imagine you did. And it's I think it's quite remarkable, especially, you know, for someone such as myself growing up. You know, apartheid, we were aware of what it was, but it was so far away. You know, for you growing up in that environment, and for you and the band to be sort of at the forefront of trying to tackle that head on, it must have been pretty daunting at times. Sure was. You know, we had records banned. As I said, shows closed. It was interesting because in the early days, it was really a cultural activism rather than political. It was really two young guys going, hey, we just love the music. You know, Johnny had become a student of Zulu music. He met a street cleaner, an apartment cleaner on the street, and went up to his room and said, you know, teach me. This is a 15-year-old white kid who is caught, you know, on top of the building in a room of the cleaner, and the superintendent wanted to throw him out, et cetera, et cetera. Right. So there were many struggles of him sort of learning the stuff. And then when Sipho came to town, he was an illiterate gardener. He moved from Zululand to work in a garden in Johannesburg. And of course, the Zulus are very competitive people.
Yeah.
And he heard about this white boy, and he went to the white boy and said, "I hear you think you could play guitar. I'm going to challenge you."
Right.
And through that became, a lifelong friendship and partnership, which was fascinating to just see the interaction. I mean, real brothers. And it was not without its problems. I mean, it was quite ironic because the one song that was the first real hit for the band was a song called Impi, which is basically a song about the Zulu British War, a battle where the Zulus were totally outnumbered and won the battle, even though they lost the war. Right. But this became an anthem. This was this big African chant. And without radio playing it, it just became a huge hit because the kids in the townships really, took this on as one of their anthems. And during protests and whatever, they'd be running down the street shouting ENP, ENP. And eventually we won a Radio Zulu award because of the listeners' votes, even though we'd really never been played on the radio.
Right.
And the real irony was that a number of years later, this became the main theme for the Springbok rugby team.
Right.
I don't think they understood what the original meaning of this song was, but it became to this day when the Springboks run onto the field, they play that song.
Right. Oh, there you go. I mean, there's the influence just it spreads and it spreads and it spreads. Of course, you and Johnny mentioned in the liner notes for Paul Simon's Graceland. I know you were certainly quite instrumental in the recording of that.
Yeah. Well, we can talk about that as a separate story at some point.
Yes, yeah. Well,
if you pay enough.
We will no doubt get to it as we go. Oh, I did want to talk to you. I saw an interview with you that was done as a sort of precursor to the Johnny Clegg documentary. Just a brief sort of Q&A. And you were talking about the fact that he was, as you approached him, he was about to sign with another label, and he wasn't particularly happy with the deal that had been placed in front of him. And I mean, I'd love to hear more about the blossoming of your relationship with him, because obviously you produced all of his albums, so that's obviously going to be a massive relationship that would have developed over time. Could I get you to talk a little more about that?
Sure. I produced all of the Juluka and Savuka, which was his second band's albums. Yeah. He did some solo albums after that, even though we became very close friends. It was the end of our business relationship, and he did, he basically independently did some albums. Right. But it was a very weird start to a relationship. I'd met his mother, who had previously been a PRO for our record label.
Right.
And she used to come into the office and go, my son Johnny, can you introduce him to Simon and Garfunkel's manager? Weirdly enough, there was a relationship eventually, but, right. And my boss and I would kind of roll our eyes and go, yes, Muriel, yeah, of course we'll do something. And then I had seen Johnny and Sipa perform while I was at uni. They were playing at the university, and they did a show. A nice little side note to that. They used to do, apart from playing, they used to do Zulu dancing. The dancing was a big part of Johnny's life. He really got involved in the lifestyle of the black migrant workers at the hostels in Johannesburg, and used to dance every weekend, and was considered one of the best dancers, even though he was a white boy. Right. Something very, very unique. But anyway, so, I had been wanting to do this experimental music of mixing the black and white music, and had really struggled, not managed to get anything going. And one night I was sitting in my study and thinking, I don't know what to do. I was pretty frustrated. And I opened the drawer, I don't know what made me do it. And there was the program from the show that I'd seen many years ago at the university. So I literally went to the phone book. There were phone books in those days. They used to print them. And no iPhones. And looked up his mom's name and called her. Said, Muriel, what's happening? She said, well, Johnny's calling. I won't mention the name of the company. He's going tomorrow to sign an agreement with one of the other labels. So I said, oh, that's a pity. She said, why? I said, well, because I really think that, this should be expanded beyond. They were just doing traditional Zulu music.
Right.
And she said, well, that company really only wants to do traditional music. What do you want to do? I said, I really want to explore the combination of doing that music with Western music and Western culture. And she said, that's exactly what Johnny wants to do. But no, this label doesn't want to do that. So I'm going to tell him not to sign and at least to come and meet you. So we always had two slightly different kind of interpretations of the first meeting. Mine was, into my office walks this bohemian madman. He was an anthropology student, big afro, looked like he'd just come out the bush in his outfit, the typical, it was almost, dressed like the old look of the African photographer who'd come out the bush,
Yes.
his safari jacket and his boots and whatever, but this big beard, just the two eyes peering out of this bunch of hair. And I thought, well, this guy's a little wacko. And his interpretation was, I walked into this office and there was this white boy sitting there on his plush leather couch, really, how am I ever going to talk to this guy, and how are we really going to understand each other? But, we had some conversations, and it turned out that it was a brotherhood, a real relationship. I mean, I would think that through those years, when you make, I think it was 13 albums together, the amount of time you spend in a studio, we spent more time with each other than we did with our families.
Yeah.
And it lasted until the day he unfortunately passed away 2 years ago. He had pancreatic cancer.
Yeah. And yet that decision had such an impact on the music industry, and certainly bringing that sound, the Zulu sound, and to the greater audience. And I think, from that you get into there was a whole movement, with the Soweto String Quartet and all of that coming out, a real interest in the African music, which then gets Hans Zimmer into that, which then does the Power of One soundtrack, which I believe you're involved with. Then from there, he goes on to do The Lion King and stuff like that. It's amazing how this decision, this sort of drive that was within you to merge these two musical styles, basically is the catalyst for a movement that changed so much about the musical landscape.
Thanks. I don't think of it that way, but I guess it might be. Certainly the point was that with Jaluka, we signed the Scatterings album, which was the album that had the song Scatterings of Africa on it, which had been the hit in the UK, to Warner's in the US. Right. And that was really the genesis of the relationship between myself and Lenny Waronker, who was the CEO of Warner's.
Right.
And how, one morning at 2 a.m, because I've never found that Americans really understand that the rest of the world is maybe on a time difference. It happens much more now, but in those days, the US was the US and the rest of the world was somewhere else. Yes. And, 2 o'clock in the morning, my phone rings and I hear Hilton, hold for Lenny Waronker. So, hey, Lenny, how you doing? 2 a.m. I'm sorry, I didn't realize. He says, Paul Simon has come to me and told me that he's found this South African song that somebody gave him on a cassette. And he really doesn't know what it is, but he loves it. Right. The song is on a compilation called Accordion Jive Hits No. 2. And it's the first song on the side 1 or something, but there's no liner notes, there's no anything. Can you sort of do some research? So I went looking and I found out that it was a song called Gumboots by the Boyoyo Boys. In fact, it was a Zulu name for it at the time anyway. But so I phoned back and I said, look, I found out what it was. He says, well, look, would you mind if Paul called you? So I'm going, would I mind if Paul Simon calls me? Yeah, maybe he can give me a call. So Paul called and I said, look, this is the situation. So he said, what? I said, what are you going to do with it? He said, well, I've written a lyric over it and I really love it. I'm not sure what I'm going to do though. So I said, he said, can I get the multi-track recordings of this? I said, mate, this was recorded in 1968. And I know that what was happening in those sessions. These things were recorded directly to 2-track tape. And there's certainly no ways that there's going to be a multi-track of this. But I could, what do you want to do? He said, I have no idea. I said, why don't you make an album of South African, influenced by South African music? He said, well, how am I going to do that? I said, let me send you a whole bunch of material. And also I can put together the original band that played on the song. Even though you can't get a multi-track, you could re-record it and work with them. So he's about a month or two later, he called me back. He went, 30 albums. I've really gone through them. There's a few things that I really like. Why don't we set up some recording sessions in Johannesburg with the following groups, which we did. And it started, the first week was with Tawe Matsecha, which was the band that did Boy in the Bubble. Mm-hmm. General MD Shurinda and the Gaza Sisters, who eventually became the artist behind the song I Know What I Know. And the Boyoyo Boys. So that was where it started. And then at the end of that week, we kind of took the best musicians from the different groups and put together a core group. And so those 3 songs were effectively derivatives of original South African songs. The original writers certainly got their credit and their share of royalties, right, and put those artists on the map. The second week, we had a band in the studio with Ray Piri, Bagiti, on guitar, Bagiti Kamado on bass, Isaac Mchali on drums as the key band that ended up becoming the basis of the Graceland band, and started working as, building songs from the ground up. So, one day Ray came in and, listen to this riff. It was like, okay, well, let's work on that, et cetera, et cetera. And this ultimately became, a slightly large selling album called Graceland.
Yeah. Amazing. We'll get more into that as we go, I'm sure. Although I dare say, so it was Accordion Hits number 7, did you say?
Number 2.
Number 2. So your accordion background came into play again.
Nothing to do with it whatsoever. Maybe, again, something I hadn't thought of, but maybe there was some cosmic connection.
Yeah. Well, you never know. Let's jump into the categories, because that is the format that we like to follow here with the Never Ending 80s podcast. And the first category that we go into is your favorite 80s song.
Would have to be Time After Time by Cyndi Lauper.
Fabulous.
There is a story that not everything that I do is connected to a story, but there is a connection to that Angelica as well.
That is great.
I got a call from Rick Chertoff, who was the producer of the Cyndi Lauper album.
Right.
That was number 1 at the time. And he was an A&R guy at CBS in the US. At that point, I had no longer had an association with CBS Records in South Africa.
Okay.
But Rick said, I love the album Scatterings. I just think it's incredible, and I'd love to work with you guys. So I said, well, we signed to Warner's in the States. He said, well, look, just come and have a chat. Let's see if there's anything we can work out. So Johnny and I flew over. We had, literally, this was the craziest flight. We left Johannesburg on a Monday night. On a Sunday night, got to New York Monday after a 17-hour flight because of the time difference. Spent the day in meetings with Rick and the guys at CBS, and got on the plane that night because Johnny had a show the next day in South Africa. So it was, needless to say, a little bit of alcohol was consumed on the plane to kill the pain. But yes, we never managed to work anything out with CBS, but through that, we met Rob Hyman and Eric Bazillion from the Hooters, who were, in fact, the band for Cyndi Lauper, and became close friends with them. And they told us that through the entire tour, the band and Cyndi listened to the Scatterings album every night on the tour bus after their shows.
Wow.
And really loved it. And then, in fact, on the Heat, Dust and Dreams album, a number of years later with Savuka, Eric said, listen, I'd love, I've got some time off and I'd love to play on the album, and sat in on all the rehearsals and played mandolin and guitar on that album for us.
Wow. That's amazing.
So it was more combinations than just a white boy and a Zulu boy.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Certainly a lot of different iterations. I did find it quite interesting with Time After Time that it was, Cindy thought she was done with the album, and it was the label that pushed her to do another song, and so she and Rob wrote Time After Time. And the story that I read was that she went, well, I've got no idea what I want to do. And so she thumbed through the TV guide or something and saw the name of a 1978 or 79 sci-fi film called Time After Time, which
Didn't know that.
Yeah, starred Malcolm McDowell. And the story of that sci-fi film is it's H.G. Wells using his time machine to pursue Jack the Ripper, who I believe has stolen his time machine or something. It's a weird one, but yeah, needless to say, they went, well, we'll take the title and scrap the plot and come up with our own story. Yeah. But
I love the song. It's a beautiful song, and the production was amazing. And there's another South African connection I'm not sure you're aware of there, that the drummer was Anton Fig.
Oh, right.
Anton was, at the time, the drummer for the David Letterman band.
Oh, right.
And became certainly one of the top 3 drummers in New York for sessions in between doing their gigs for David Letterman every evening. Wow. And Anton was the drummer on that track.
Wow. There you go.
See, we're everywhere.
Yeah. The South African connection just permeates all through the music industry, I have no doubt. I mean, it is such a beautiful musical culture. All right, so we'll come to your next category, which is your favorite 80s album.
These are tough choices. There's more than one album I love, but I think
it's hard to narrow.
Yeah, it was between Peter Gabriel, So, and I think my number one choice, though, would probably be Tears for Fears, Songs from the Big Chair.
Right, yeah.
I had nothing to do and no connection with the record. but just loved it. I mean, the production was amazing. The melodic structure was fantastic. I do have a recollection of going to a meeting in New York at some point with Johnny in a cab, and hearing Everybody Wants to Rule the World on the radio, and both looking at each other for the first time and saying, wow, this is really, really special.
Yeah, amazing production on that album. I have very vivid memories of it coming out. In fact, in many respects, Tears for Fears are probably one of the first bands that I really remember becoming aware of as a band, rather than, oh, I like that song and I like that song. With Songs from the Big Chair in particular, I can't remember the order that the songs came out, but you had Everybody Wants to Rule the World, you had Shout, Head Over Heels was also on that album, and it was this thing of going, gee, I like all of these songs and they're the same band. Some amazing production on that album. Everybody Wants to Rule the World is the guitar riff is absolutely fabulous.
And that polyrhythmic riff of the rhythm section and the drums is something which actually it's kind of that 3/4 versus 4/4 kind of thing is quite prevalent in Zulu music as well.
Right. Well, there you go. So there is possibly a bit of a connection there. I tried doing it acoustically. We've done it acoustically a few times with the Never Ending 80s, but I tried doing it acoustically, relatively unrehearsed, and it was an absolute mess, because trying to get that timing down it's a very difficult. It's deceptively difficult, because it sounds quite simple, because it melds together so beautifully, but it is quite difficult to work out the timing. Certainly when you're trying to count the sort of very counterpoint rhythms and things.
But I think that's a lesson that I learned very early on in the industry, was that the best records and the best albums, songs, tracks, whatever you want to call them these days, often are the ones that sound the simplest, even though they're not really simple. on in the background.
Yeah. It's funny, I often get asked why we think that the 80s music has lasted so long. And one of the reasons that I often give is that in the 80s, pop music wasn't something to be embarrassed by. It wasn't dismissed and it wasn't frowned upon. And so you had genuinely talented musicians working in that field. And so it's exactly that thing where you've got what sounds like pop and it sounds easy and it sounds disposable is actually very complicated, very intense, but it's just melded together so beautifully. And I think what happened beyond that was somewhere around the 90s, we suddenly got very navel gazing with music, and it had to be, if it was going to be, if you were a musician, you had to be playing serious music, because if you were playing pop, then it was 3 chords and a basic melody, and that was all that pop music needed to be. And, you know, one of those 3 chords was extraneous at best.
Yeah.
So I do think that a lot of that music is so good because it sounds simple and yet it is so musically accomplished, and so many of the songs from the Big Chair are in that, they fall into that category where you think it's, you know, you can listen and go, oh, that's fine, but then, and I mean, Peter Gabriel, of course, is another great example of that. So it's not surprising to me that So was the other album that you were torn on there.
Yeah.
Of course, the big story with songs from the Big Chair, which it's one of those stories that if you know it, you hear it everywhere, is of course where the title comes from, which I did not know until about a year ago. But are you familiar with where the title comes from?
No, I'm not. I'm eagerly awaiting a lesson.
So the Big Chair that they are referring to, it's actually a reference to the movie Sybil, which you may recall was about a woman with who was abused as a child and had multiple different dissociative personalities. The Big Chair in that is the analyst's chair, which is the only place that she feels safe. And so, yeah, it's kind of, you know, a title that again, you know, seems on the surface to be fairly, oh yeah, songs from the Big Chair. And you go, oh no, this is, you know, quite intricate. You know, these are the songs that come from, you know, dealing with your inner demons as such, you know, being in the Big Chair, I think is great. Apparently it was also a response to their first album had been quite a traumatic experience from them, their interaction with the record label.
Oh, I've never heard that type of a story before.
Yes, I can imagine. Well, I mean, yes, yeah, they record labels loved you all the way through what you were doing with Jaluka, of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that is a fantastic choice for your favorite 80s album. It is a hard category. I mean, I think they're all hard categories. You're dealing with a decade of some pretty amazing popular culture stuff. And, of course, 1985, when Songs from the Big Chair comes out, that sort of 84, 85 period, it's one of those golden periods in popular culture. The movies that were coming out were absolutely, you know, just incredible films. Albums, you know, occasionally I'll pull up a list of albums released in 84 and 85, and it is jaw-dropping, the number of classic, great albums that came out in that period. We come to your next category, which is your favorite 80s movie.
Hands down, Rain Man.
Fantastic. And if I'm not incorrect, you appear, you have a hand in Rain Man in no small way?
No, a very small way. It was actually, in 1987, I moved from South Africa to LA, set up a studio there. And that was where we recorded the last 3 Savuka albums. I spent 10 years there before I moved to Australia.
Right.
But shortly after I arrived there, I had a call from a guy who became a very close mate of mine called Alan Mason, who, apart from having worked at A&M Records as a promo guy, and earlier on, had become and has become a pretty serious music supervisor for movies. And at the time, he was doing all of Barry Levinson's movies. He was at school with Barry in Baltimore.
Oh, right.
And Alan was a rather unusual character. You went to visit his house near Venice Beach, and literally every single room was like a record warehouse. It was just albums. He lived there on his own. There was a bed in the bedroom, but everywhere else, there was a couple of seats in the living room. Everywhere else was just albums, in shelves, and all absolutely incredibly catalogued. Mm-hmm. But anyway, he said, look, Barry, I've played Barry Scatterings of Africa, and he just loves it. And he wants to put it in the movie. He wants to use it somewhere. So again, obviously, we decided we did a slightly different mix of it. This was now Scatterings of Africa recorded twice with Johnny. First, we had the hit in '83 with Chiluka.
Yes. And
then when we did Savuka a few years later, I suggested that we redo the song in a slightly different format because the original song had timings all over the place. It was just how Johnny wrote it. There was 7/4 verses and 4/4 and a 3/4 and all types of things. And we ended up putting it into commercializing it, right. Putting it into a little bit more of a 4/4, 4-bar structure. And we had a huge hit with that in Europe. And that was the one that they wanted in the movie, but we did a slightly different mix, not a remix in the contemporary sense of changing everything, but purely just mixing the song slightly differently. Right. And if you don't know where it is, there's a scene where Raymond is Dustin Hoffman and Tom Cruise are driving through the desert, and the radio is on, and they're listening to Scatterings of Africa.
Right. I will go back and watch it, but I don't for an instant think that that's the only reason that that Rain Man is your favorite 80s film. Do you want to talk us through your experiences with it?
Well, just my experiences of, firstly, while I was sitting at Alan's place, and this will lead into another discussion, obviously, he said to me, just take a listen to this. And he played me a soundtrack to an album, a movie called A World Apart, right, which was a South African movie about very anti-apartheid movie right. about one of the communist South Africans, and Hans was a ghostwriter on that album. Right, he hadn't been credited with it, but he said, "Just take a listen to this. I've got to get this guy to do the Rain Man soundtrack." And I just remember going to the preview of Rain Man and just hearing firstly the soundtrack. Apart from anything else, I thought that the acting performance was very credible. I thought the story was amazing. Oh, yeah. And, Hans's music just leapt out. It was the first time we'd ever heard just about anything like that in a contemporary movie.
Yeah.
But loved everything about the movie.
Yeah. Did you just see it in the cinema? Did you get to go to a special screening of it, or...?
Yeah, I was at the preview screening.
Excellent. Was was there a dry eye in the house?
It was really, it was an emotional experience. That everybody was flipping out. It was a very unusual kind of movie in all senses.
Yeah, it's an incredible film. I was reading that Barry Morrow, who was one of the screenwriters, was saying that when his original draft, he didn't set out to make a movie about autism. In fact, he didn't really know about autism when he wrote the first draft. He was basically just focusing a film on this relationship between the two brothers and their fragile relationship, it was interesting because I was then reading an article which was saying, is Rain Man the best thing ever for autism, or is it problematic? And a therapist said it was easily the best thing for autism, because no amount of public awareness or PR we could have done could have brought the attention to this ailment that the film did. Yeah, I think it's Absolutely amazing film. Very emotional film. And you are right, that soundtrack, it was so unique. I think it might have been probably one of, my earliest exposures to Hans Zimmer's music. And again, he was one of those composers that, you'd suddenly look at your catalogue of albums that you'd bought and you went, oh, well, they're all by the same guy. He's quite talented, isn't he?
Yeah.
Yeah. And I
well,
think...
he's back. He was with Trevor Horn in Buggles. Video Killed the Radio Star was the first exposure he had to pop music.
I am ashamed that I didn't know that. That is amazing. And I'm embarrassed that I didn't know that, and I dare say people are probably screaming at me right now for not knowing that, and I'll have to hand my 80s card in. Although
You're fired.
Yeah. I'll get it in under the line by saying, Video Killed the Radio Star came in '79, so that's before my time. That's amazing. I did not know that at all.
Yeah.
There you go.
In fact, if you see the video, you see Trevor playing bass and young Hans banging around on the keyboard.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's funny. Rain Man is 89% fresh score on Rotten Tomatoes, 90% audience score, which means, yes, it is a great film. It's a beloved film. I remember having a chat with somebody who told me it was his favorite film, which was the point that I decided I needed to have a favorite film. I never really had, he said, what's your favorite movie? And I was like, I don't know, I love them all. And he was like, no, you've got to narrow it down to one. Mine's Rain Man. And so, yeah, I couldn't take Rain Man, so I chose Jaws.
There are a couple of other incredible movies from that era. When Harry Met Sally has one of the most iconic scenes that you'll ever see in a movie.
Yes.
I sat on that sign at Katz's Deli, by the way, in New York. I had to go and sit at that table where the sign says, "This is where Harry met Sally."
Yes. Well, can I tell you something? I bought it on video, on VCR. When I first finished high school, I had about 6 months where I was neither studying nor employed, and I would watch When Harry Met Sally at least once a week. Quite often, every day, I would watch it. I was a bit sad. But in 2010, I was in America, and we just arrived in New York, and we ended up at Katz's Deli. I didn't realize we were in Katz's Deli. We walked in, and my girlfriend at the time, now my wife, she can't eat wheat. So we walked in, she was gluten intolerant. We went, we can't eat here. And then so we went elsewhere. And the next day I realized we'd been in Katz's Deli and I hadn't even
gone and sat at the table.
So yeah, that's also a great film, one of my favorites. But I think you've made the correct choice. Not that there can be a correct choice, but Rain Man is an absolutely outstanding film from the 80s.
I also knocked out E.T.
Sorry? Oh.
It also knocked out E.T. for me, yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So those are probably my top three.
Okay. That's a good top three.
I know you didn't ask, but...
Listen, but I like that you've offered. That is all. If you want to run through... Would you say they're your top three of all time or just simply from the 80s?
I haven't done much thinking about that. I can't imagine it's of all time, but certainly, Rain Man certainly of all time, one of the top three.
Yeah, fantastic. Let's move on to our next category, which is, of course, favorite 80s TV show.
Not a lot of cerebral stuff there, but I think just because I understood what was going on in the background, that WKRP in Cincinnati has to have been one of my favorites. Love the characters. I mean, Venus Flytrap and Dr. Johnny Fever. You'd met one of each of those somewhere along the line.
Yes, absolutely, and a lot of them were based on real people, which probably made it so real. A lot of the episodes, I understand, were based on actual events.
Actual incidents.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And absolute earworm of a song. It's funny, I would not have seen an episode of WKRP in Cincinnati since the 80s. and even then it would have been early 80s because you know, they weren't big on repeats of it, certainly in Australia back then. But the theme is still
Theme song.
like
Yeah,
permanently etched into my brain.
it is. It is one of those great theme songs.
Yeah. And obviously, I mean, it's again no real surprise that it was such an impact for you, such a favorite, because it heavily featured music at the time, which is kind of the great shame, is that you know, even though you can get the DVD now or you can watch it on streaming and stuff like that, it doesn't have the original music, and the episodes of the shows so tightly worked the songs in with them. And I think, I was reading Heart of Glass. I think Blondie credited the show so much with the popularity of the song that they actually gifted them the gold album when it received it, which was hanging in the offices of WKRP. Yeah. So that is kind of the pity, is that, you know, that the tying the music so intricately in with the storyline has been lost through, you know, subsequent syndication. But it was funny, I was reading that they filmed on videotape rather than on film, because there was a loophole which had been created for variety shows that if you were shooting on video, you paid less for music royalties. And because they wanted to feature music so heavily, they went, well, let's film on videotape because we can get the royalties for cheaper. But of course, once it went into syndication, that was no longer an option.
Well, I learned something there. I thought I knew all about royalties. I didn't realize that.
I think that law may have changed. I don't know if you can still manipulate it. But certainly in the US, that was the case. Which brings us to your final category, which I've had a little preview of what your favorite 80s memory is, and I'm very excited to talk about this. So, Hilton Rosenthal, please tell us your favorite 80s memory.
Again, a tough one, because obviously recording with Paul Simon has to have been up there as one of my favorite memories of all time.
Absolutely.
But there, you know, it was a time where hunger was always hunger is an issue. But hunger in South Africa was becoming a major issue. And I was driving on a Saturday morning, listening to a radio station that was the first talk station, in fact, in South Africa, called Radio 702, which was located outside of the official borders of South Africa in Bophuthatswana, one of the homelands. You know, the apartheid government created different areas. This was really the crux of apartheid, was to separate each of the ethnic groups so that you could basically, you know, reduce their power, should we say. And Radio 702 had a license to broadcast out of Bophuthatswana, which was a bunch of little territories, not even a contiguous territory, but near about 50 miles out of Johannesburg. And I had a very close relationship with the CEO of the radio station, who called me up. Well, I listened to the radio station on the Saturday, and I heard that they were having a telethon raising money for Operation Hunger, which was a hunger organization feeding people, starving people in South Africa. And I heard one of the artists phone up and say, his name is Pierre de Chamois, I'd like to challenge all other artists to donate 50 Rand. And I thought, well, that's a very cool idea. But, you know, do I want to phone up and say I want to challenge every music company or record executive or producer to 100, 1,000, whatever it is? You know, it's not really. I wish I could do something a lot bigger. So I put it in the back of my mind for the day, and literally by coincidence, on the following Monday, 2 days later, I get a call from Izzy Kirsch, who was the CEO of the radio station, to say, we've just put in some new transmitters at our broadcast center in Botswana, and I'm going out there for lunch on Monday today. Do you want to come? I said, well, yeah, it's a bit of a long drive. He said, no, we're going by helicopter. I said, no, okay. So we got in we went up and we had lunch. And on the way back, when we were flying back into Johannesburg, we flew over Ellis Park, the stadium, which was the big rugby stadium. And as we flew over, I said, I heard your telethon on Saturday. And I thought I'd love to do something with all artists for Operation Hunger. I wonder if we could get Ellis Park and do a concert. So he said, you know what, Louis Late, who's the head of the rugby board and is also head of the stadium, I know very well. We'll go back to the office or call him and we'll ask. So literally got back to the office. He phoned me an hour later and said, Louis said you can have the stadium for free as long as you pay for the cleaning up. That's all. So that started a process which took literally the initial process 3 days, where I just got on the phone, called every artist, every manager, every record label, etc. The acoustic, Coliseum Acoustics, the sound tire company, the lighting company, anything that needed to be done in a concert, I got donated free within 3 days. And it ended up as a concert with 24 acts, 12 of whom were white, 11 or 12 were black, and Juluka as the one mixed act. And we have no idea. It was 6 months before Live Aid. Right. So it wasn't like we were copying something else. Yeah. We had the stadium. We had a situation where we didn't know how many people to expect. Mm. And I had a deal with Percy Tucker, who was the guy that owned CompuTicket. Now, I think that at that point in time, CompuTicket was the only electronic ticketing system in the world. It also originated out of South Africa. Right. And he gave me the sale of tickets for free without commission as well. So we started doing publicity, kicking it in. And on the Wednesday, we had sold 10,000 tickets. Okay. On the Thursday, we had sold 15,000 tickets. On the Friday at lunchtime, we had sold 35,000 tickets. So we thought, this is pretty good. With a walk-up, we'll probably get 50,000 people. Yeah. Turned out the stadium could effectively hold 90 to 100,000 with the seats and the ground, but there was stage taking up a certain part of it. Mm. We ended up with 120,000 people. And it was one of those moments that, in a moment in time where it obviously was meant to be, because it could have been an absolute disaster. I actually watched the movie of Woodstock a couple of months ago again. And, right. The fact that without major catastrophe went through, I kind of got the same feeling. We had a day where everything just worked. I mean, at 2:00, I got a call on the walkie-talkie saying there's problems at the South Gate. The crowd was pushing so hard that the gates came down, and I ran out and I just saw this gate come down and just a wall of people running in. And we just said, well, you can't stop them, you just let them in. So, I mean, literally we had these 120,000 people there. The sound system was built for probably 30 to 40,000. I think we had every piece of equipment in those days that South Africa had for a live show. Right. We got through it. And, at about 6 p.m. that evening, the head of police came to me and he said, Mr. Rosenthal, I don't know, we normally have rugby matches here with 30,000 people, and I've got hundreds and hundreds of arrests. He said, we've got this. And it was literally, I mean, you can't talk about exact percentages, but it was half black, half white audience, half black, half white musicians and artists. Not hardly an incident. He said, we've had 30 arrests the whole day, and all very minor offenses of people being drunk and just kind of thrown them out. And, over time, I remember Louis Lake standing with me. And when Juluka went on at like 7:30 in the evening, the place just went insane. And Louis looked at me and he went, I don't know what you've done here, And I said, well, I think maybe we've shown South Africa that things can get together. And the concert has been written up often as, the first time where South Africans realized, I mean, Juluka was always considered the act that could show that South Africa could make it, could become a multiracial society.
Yeah.
But this concert, kind of proved it as well. So it will always be in my mind as my number one memory.
That is an amazing memory. It would definitely be a treasured one, I can imagine.
Yep.
That's great. I mean, there's nothing I can say or ask about it. That is, absolutely incredible. I think we might even leave it there, Hilton. I think that's a beautiful place to leave it. You've certainly, as I said at the start, you've had a greater impact than I think people would realise, and certainly I certainly appreciate that you, way back when, had that desire to merge the two. Well, I mean, even beyond that, I'm glad you had the desire to walk into a record company and say, I don't know what I'm doing, but give me a job.
Yeah, thank you. That's great.
It was an absolute pleasure to meet you, Hilton. So thank you very much for joining us here on the Never Ending 80s podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
That's going to do it for this episode of the Never Ending 80s podcast. If you would like to send us a question or a comment, or maybe you want to send us your very own personal favourite 80s list with your favourite 80s song, album, TV show, movie and memory, you can contact us at any80spodcast@gmail.com. I'm J.C.Hollywood. I want to thank my guest, Hilton Rosenthal. I'll see you next time for another Never Ending 80s podcast. This episode of the Never Ending 80s podcast is brought to you by Sleeshman Drum Co. Pioneering sound innovation since 1971, the Sleeshman Drum Company are the inventors of the modern-day twin double bass pedal, a revolutionary product making life easier for drummers everywhere. They also pioneered the free-floating acoustic drum. Now, if like me you have no idea what that means, it's a drum tuning system that doesn't bolt onto the drum's shell, i.e. the wooden bit that makes the drum sound good. This results in a great-sounding drum with more tone than ever before. Created in Australia and still manufactured in Australia, Sleeshman drums are exported around the globe to some of the world's best drummers, including Queen's own Roger Taylor. They're even the kit of choice for the Never-Ending 80s own Davey Rocket. So if you are in the market for a new kit, make sure it's a Sleeshman.